I am happy to be here to introduce Robert Lange, who, since he has moved to Tryon, has become an enormous asset for Tryon history. We talked this morning, I wanted to make sure I had a little bit of his bio down. It's interesting, it turns out he was born on Mars, raised on Venus, and is a proud graduate of Starfleet Academy. So with that, he grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and he moved to Tryon from Charleston, where he had previously retired as a business development manager, business development personage, most lately with AT&T. When Robert got here, he became very curious about Tryon history. We all get bitten with that bug one time or another. And he began researching to get Melrose Avenue declared an historic district. As he was going through records, he began to see in deeds references to a map of Tryon. And it kept happening time after time. And so he was at the courthouse and said, I keep finding references to this map. Do you know where it is? And they said, well, there's this room over here and there's a stack of maps and maybe it's there, kind of thing. And he went in and, by God, there in a loose stack of sheets was the original map that was drawn by Lemuel Wilcox in 1877. There it is. And it turns out, those of us who even grew up in Tryon really did not understand the importance of this man. We knew about the Wilcox house, that is often referred to, unfortunately, as the Sidney Lanier house. Sidney spent several months there where he died, but it was the Wilcox house, and we're trying to get it properly designated. And he bought approximately 4,000 acres from Columbus Mills, including Tryon Mountain, Hornback Mountain, all of Tryon, and then commenced to lay out the town in lots. And
Julia, give him my speech.
Oh. Mr. Lange.
One of the challenges about understanding Tryon history is that there's really a lack of reliable source information. For the most part, there really hasn't been any institutional archiving. And so stories are handed down from family to family through generations of disappearing families. There are very few, I see at least three of the earliest families, or two of the earliest families here. But basically, there are a lot of pieces around that we're all trying to uncover and turn into a story. Fortunately, the archives that Jerry Soderquist is working on will hopefully help with this town archives, and in the future people will understand. But right now there's just a lot of pieces that several people in this room are helping to uncover. Mike McHugh focusing on the arts, for example. And so many things that we wouldn't have understood without his and other people's efforts. So my own involvement began when my then wife and I purchased a home just a block down from Chris Armbruster. And let this be a warning to you all. If he ever gives you the, do you have a moment? Just run. Just go. Quickly. So I soon found myself searching through the history of the properties on Melrose, trying to understand the families and the people that had come through. And I began discovering some fascinating people that have been long forgotten, that have done a lot for this town. For example, the story of Dr. Charles Kentworthy is, who I personally consider the most intellectually robust person that's ever been in this town. That's a separate talk in and of itself. I mean, it's a fascinating story. It's a fascinating man. But that was just part of the puzzle, understanding the people. The story of understanding the property transfers told me a lot and introduced me to a lot of the people and how they came about and how the community was formed. And as Julia mentioned, I'm going through deeds, and I've got tons of deeds that trying to sort through. They're all from how, who bought what where, and from who, and then who sold and who moved in and out. And they tell such a fascinating story. And as Julia mentioned, I kept running into this wording, which was something along the lines of as known as lot number 49 on L.N. Wilcox's map of Tryon City. So I went through looking for this map, desperately looking for this map. And one thing I want to state ahead of time is most of the stuff I'm going to tell you today is not conjecture, it's not guessing, it's things that I've got a lot of good source material, and that a lot of it has been reviewed by some of my colleagues. And but I do have a number of theories. I will let you know about those as I run into them. But first, I have a quick pop quiz. Does anybody know when the town of Tryon became the town of Tryon? What year?
Bobby knows.
Now, Bobby's not allowed to tell.
1869.
1886.
Yeah. Well, the common thought is it's 1885, and that's partially true. I'll get to that in a second. And do you know who our first mayor was?
Alan Peoples.
So the answer to the first one is not 1885. That's when the state chartered the town of Tryon City, which, according to a woman by the name of Helen Ashley Carver. Has anybody heard of her?
Yeah.
She was a fascinating woman. She came here in 1885 and with her mother, and she lived here for a very long time, and she began writing a series of articles for the Tryon Daily Bulletin, about 1930s or so. She was basically the Garland, but the first Garland Mifflin, if you will. And in her notes, in one of her columns, she noted that the city form of government was chosen to keep out the saloon. So I know nothing about municipalities, but apparently by 1891, the town the state rechartered the town. I've got a bunch of handouts, so I'm just going to pass these around as I go through. This is actually the charter from 1891 in the state records, where they renamed it from the town of Tryon City to the town of Tryon. And although Ballinger was the first mayor of the town of Tryon City, I'm guessing since he was a state senator, they couldn't name him as the mayor of the town of Tryon. So his good friend, Dr. Kentworthy, sat in for a month and a half as the mayor until the election came and re-elected Ballinger. So we're going to take a step back really far. We're going to go back to the Civil War. And this is an area that I haven't done a whole lot of research in. There are people probably in this room that have far more knowledge about it than I do. But because really, about that time, all I know is what I saw in the movie Cold Mountain. But it's a very important incident, and the incident I'm about to describe was the subject of talk at the Polk County Historical Museum a few years back, and there is a book being written about it by a woman by the name of Pam Wilson, and being helped by Jack Underwood. I don't know if any of you know them. They have spent a lot of time here in their younger days, and she's now a professor at some small school in Georgia. And they're writing a book called Not So Neighborly, The Polk County Massacre. And if you if you Google that, you'll find all the research they've released, including all the characters, who they were, what they did, and everything else. And there are several descendants of this still around Polk County, including the Mills family there, represented by Ambrose. And they all have their story, but I think the Weavers and the Mills have buried the hatchet. So, at any rate, it's only recently that I made the connection between this massacre and that being a pivotal moment in the founding of Tryon, and how the ownership of the land shaped the town and its social character, which, as you know, drew artists and writers and other creative sorts. And the likelihood that we were all in this, that we would all be in this room, or even in this town, if it hadn't been for that massacre, is pretty slim. So, hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll understand my position on that. So, back to the war. Emotions were running really high in the end of 1864, and the fate of the Confederacy was becoming clear, and desperation was setting in among the Confederate nationalists. As the war had stretched on, patience with the disruption from the war wore thin, and the divisions among the citizens grew. With families at home unable to feed themselves, many soldiers were forced to desert their units and return home to care for their wives and children. Northern sympathizers and those with no interest in Confederate nationalism were increasing in number and voice. Distillers, very important, were none too happy that their ability to make whiskey had been curtailed due to the regulations on the use of corn during the conflict. And they didn't really care about slavery anyway. So unrest and retribution became rampant throughout the foothills.
Hold it, question.
Yes, ma'am.
What was corn used for?
Liquor.
No, in the war.
Food.
Food.
Oh,
You had to feed the troops.
okay, they didn't put any bullets around them.
That's right. They didn't have MREs back then.
Corn cake.
So, at any rate, bands of these renegades would form together and to defend themselves from the brutal home guard, raiding plantations just in order to survive and keep from being slaughtered by the home guard. So it was within this social and political setting that the stage was set for a change in the makeup of the most prominent citizens here in Polk County. And it completely changed the direction of the social and economic future of the county. Dr. Columbus Mills, the founder and arguably the wealthiest man in Polk County, had been appointed the provost marshal to the area during this period. And this situation came to a head in November of 1864, when a party of marauding, quote-unquote, Yankees, Tories, and deserters raided Dr. Mills's plantation house, where they, quote-unquote, committed ruinous deprivations. They took Dr. Mills prisoner and continued up the Howard Gap Road to the Irwin plantation. Was that it, Mike, the Irwin plantation? Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, okay. I usually lean on Mike to confirm things. So, over the course of the next month, Dr. Mills decided he had determined who it was that raided his home, and he led the home guard on a raid of. Oh, I have something else here to pass out. These are a couple articles from papers of the day. One of them was actually from that time, immediate aftermath, and another one was a couple years later. And you get reading these, which can't do while you're sitting here, but you have two completely different sides of the whole thing. Actually, I'll pass that out just a moment. So at any rate, so they raided Pace Hunter's home, and they found the hunters outside the home, Mr. Hunter and his two sons, and they appeared to be willing to surrender, and they asked if they could go inside and grab their coats. It was a cold December day after all. And so they let them go inside and grab their coats, but what they came out with was guns and knives. And the senior hunter's last words as he rushed Dr. Mills with, I believe, 2 large Bowie knives were reported to be, "I will kill you, you damned old rascal." So neither of the Bowies punctured Dr. Mills further than his overcoat, and Hunter found himself the recipient of 7 balls from Home Guard pistols. And so he and one of his sons died, and then the posse went on to round up the other members of the party, including Frank Hunter and a few others. Frank Weaver. Frank Weaver was a successful local businessman. He also had a plantation home up Hunter Gap somewhere. And he was the distiller of the famed whiskey Weaver whiskey, in which before the war he was producing 3,500 gallons a year of. Now, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, because there's a lot of speculation, and no one knows for sure whether these were the people that actually raided his home. But the Mills family did have a long-standing debt with the Weaver family for the whiskey. So, if that played a part in it or not, I don't know.
Let it be known that these days the Mills pay for their whiskey.
Yes, Mr. Shields, how are you?
Well, the Weavers in this story, were they part of the Weavers associated with the Cox plantation?
I don't know, were they?
No, not to my knowledge.
Okay.
I have not met
I
any
think
of the
one of the
Weavers.
Weavers eventually inherited through things that got passed down,
Oh, okay,
and various people dying and divorcing and such.
okay.
And
Well,
it
if they
comes
find any
into-
bottles of that whiskey, let them know.
but that's a part of the side of my family.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next day, under the guise of transporting the prisoners up to Asheville for trial, the Home Guard unit stopped, quote unquote, not more than a mile from the village of Columbus, and executed the men, leaving them to rot in the woods, still bound and handcuffed. Now, this is where this kind of comes in. That was a very common occurrence. Governor Vance had really encouraged the swift execution for anybody that was considered to be a traitor, and he basically sanctioned the Home Guard doing these kind of things. And this is where for example, this paper, this is from a Raleigh paper in 1867, and they note that the Polk County massacre furnishes but one instance of hundreds that occurred in our western counties. The massacre occurred in December 1864, soon after the speech made by Governor Vance in the Hall of Commons, in which he said the time had come when the Civil War was too slow to punish treason, and when traitors should be exterminated as fast as they were caught. So this was basically the MO of the Home Guard back then. Just take them out in the woods and shoot them. Now, this from a paper in Columbia, South Carolina. Their version of it is, some of the North Carolina Tories are meeting with a long reserved but deserved fate. So basically they were saying that through this, that these people deserved what they got. And so you had two sides to the story even back then. You know, some people thought, I mean, there are some other stories in here, like for example, the Home Guard taking a woman in front of her two innocent little children, putting her thumbs under a fence, and then two of the soldiers sitting on that fence until while she screamed, until she gave the location of her husband, who they considered a unionist. So, anyway, I will pass these around. so, at any rate, that was by no means the end of the conflict. The Hunter and Weaver family waged a vendetta against those they held responsible for the Polk County massacre. And it was not long before a retaliatory raid was made back on Dr. Mills' plantation home, which drove the doctor. Now, Ambrose and I Ambrose has got a different story than what I'm piecing together, but I'm trying to take in all the sides here. But it apparently drove the doctor out of the county permanently, the county that he had formed, and of which he had thousands of acres behind. So while he left, there were still lots of retribution. There were gin house fires, there were house fires, barn fires, a revenge shooting, and all this went on for well over a decade. So Mills left behind him thousands of acres in a county he feared for his life in, and he could do a little more than just pay the taxes on, which he wasn't particularly happy about doing. So as the South struggled to recover from all this devastation, the area was beginning to attract investment from Northerners. Some may call them carpetbaggers. But in this case, I don't think so. We had quite an exception here. So before the war, there was a Presbyterian minister from Virginia by the name of Nathan Shotwell. And he moved down to Rutherfordton. And he had a classmate at the Western Theological Seminary who had a large family, 10 children, 4 of whom were quite sickly. And Shotwell convinced his friend, Reverend Leland McAvoy. This is a pre-restored picture that I'm passing around. I'll explain another picture in a second. And so Leland McAvoy and his son, Lynn McAvoy, and his son-in-law, Lemuel Wilcox, visited the area during the month of August 1869. Before I get to that, let me get back to this picture. This is the restored version of that picture, and this was just recently received here in Tryon from a gentleman by the name of Paul Bell from Las Vegas. And it turns out one of McAvoy's daughter married into the Bell family down in Texas, and he found that one picture, the one with that corn, in the family archives, and he was very generous, and he restored that picture for us, and sent us a couple copies for the museums. Little side note is that one of the daughters, it was Frank's daughter, Austin. Is that Frank's daughter?
Yeah. Frank's daughter, Austin.
Okay. She's said to be named after Stephen Austin, the founder of Texas, because the Bell family were descendants of Stephen Austin. So that's how apparently she got her name. But at any rate, sidetrack. So by the end of August, Lemuel Wilcox signed an agreement with Columbus Mills for the purchase of 3 tracts of land, totaling 3,880 acres, stretching from the slopes of Tryon Mountain through the Pacolet Valley and all the way into South Carolina to Hogback Mountain. He actually owned Hogback Mountain at that point. The agreed upon price for all that land was $15,000, or $3.87 an acre. Most accounts that I've seemed to have found, if there is any mention of all this activity, it was from McAvoy, his father-in-law. But all the deeds, all the transactions, all the mortgages and everything else were between Wilcox and Mills.
Who deeded the property to him?
It was Columbus Mills did. So and Columbus Mills actually financed the the transaction providing a mortgage. And I have here, this is the first paragraphs of the contract between Columbus Mills and Leland McAvoy. And this is actually a part of the mortgage where they describe how it was to work. It was $3,000 down, $2,000 12 months later in the next year, and then $1,000 a year after that. Okay, so the first track, which he closed on very quickly on, was all the Packlet Valley and up the Tryon Mountain, including the home farm, the plantation house that became the McAvoy house and later the Mimosa Inn. The second tract was 500 acres more or less, which includes the very spot we are sitting on right now. Basically everything. Francis Parker here helped me when I found that deed, and we both independently mapped it out based on the surveyor's notes. And we were pretty darn close, weren't we? We were just a smidgen off. And it went pretty much from Howard Road, right over there by Stotts Ford, all the way down to the state line. Included Gottschall Hill, Melrose, all these areas. And then the third tract, which I have not researched yet. I really need to go down to South Carolina and look through their deeds office. That was 1,700 acres, which included Hogback Mountain. Thank you. And this was actually the beginning of the deed that was for that downtown Tryon area. Okay, so they made plans to relocate from Pittsburgh, and it's actually, this is from, what I'm going to read to you is from okay, well, there it is. This is from a speech that Lemuel Wilcox's daughter, Keith Grady. Oh, by the way, to me to introduce, we have in this room the descendants of the last area descendants of Lemuel Wilcox and Leland McAvoy. Keith Grady and his daughter Fran Grady. They still have property up on Melrose. And Keith is anxious to move back here as soon as he can. And so at any rate, so his grandmother gave a speech, and we're still looking for the resemblance between he and Leland here, or excuse me, Lemuel. So she describes their journey down from Pittsburgh. She notes his son, meaning Lynn McAvoy. His son came through the country with 2 pairs of horses, the carriage, and a pair of army mules. And the family came on the train, spending nearly a week on the way, the shortest time in which the trip could be made, landing in Spartanburg, the nearest railroad station. So as they moved down here,
what year was that?
Well, they didn't come down until 1872. Lemuel came down right away when he closed on the 1,680 acres in the spring of 1870. In fact, he's in the 1870 census as a farmer. He's also in there as basically, by virtue of that purchase, he became the second wealthiest industrialist in the area, because he had inherited, with that property, he inherited a tannery, which Columbus Mills had invested a lot of money in. But he put himself down just as a farmer, But he quickly proceeded with his plans for the remaining tracks from Mills. So he had the mortgage from Mills, and over the years he refinanced that several times from his family in Pittsburgh. His in-laws were the Fleming family. His father had actually a number of oil processing facilities in Pennsylvania. He had developed a patent for some sort of the separation of oils, and they sold a lot of lighting oil products. So between that and the Fleming family, which were the druggists, and they also were bottlers and of the Fleming's Old Export Rye Whiskey and Fleming's Malt Whiskey. And they were pretty much known nationally. Now, whether any of our local brew made it into those bottles, I don't know yet. But, you know, it's highly possible, because there was, I'm sure, a lot of commerce going back between those. So finally, in 1872, they finished the deal for this land that we're on, and that's when the McAvoys came down, and he found a new calling. He had been a preacher. He had established a church, Crossroads Presbyterian Church in Allegheny County, and just outside of Pittsburgh. And he had been the pastor there since the time in the 1830s, and this was 1872. So he converted he found a new calling in hospitality, and he converted the Mills Plantation home, adding a third floor to it, and began vigorously promoting the area. And I think we have him to thank for a lot of what this region became. The term thermal belt was not one of his making. It had actually been in 1861. That's when it was first documented. And I'm just going to pass this around. This is from the U.S. Patent Office in 1861 report by Silas McDowell of Franklin, North Carolina. However, Reverend McAvoy was first to understand the commercial implications of the healthy climate and the crossroads nature of the location. He was referred to in one newspaper of the day as the Grand Cyclops of the Thermal Belt. He never stopped promoting it. And so many other newspapers gave him other similar nicknames. And so anyway, he quickly became the champion of the term and marketed this new resort accordingly, turning the plantation into a resort which would play a pivotal role in the economic growth of the county. McAvoy's regularly hosted a full house of 30 rooms, and over the winters and during the summer, they had to erect tents on the grounds around the McAvoy house in order to accommodate everybody. Okay, when all this was going on, the route, and I am not a railroad expert by any stretch of the imagination, so if I'm wrong on any of this, somebody please correct me. But the route had not been determined, and the thought was at the time that it was going to go through Columbus and go up Howard Gap Road. As we all know, that didn't happen, but whichever route the railroad ended up going with, it was going to go through Wilcox's property, and he knew it. There are varying degrees of understanding of Wilcox's role in all this, and his role in with the railroad. However, it is certain that he did a lot of surveying with the railroad. He was close with the railroad engineers, close with the railroad executives, because of course they all stayed at the McAvoy house. And by this time, it had become, by the mid-1870s, it had become the most popular resort in western North Carolina.
Sir, am I correct, when you're saying the McAvoy house, you're referring to Mimosa? I mean, what was Mimosa?
What
The green
was
light-
Mimosa?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the building we now know as Mimosa, owned by Kevin Parker back there, was actually built in 1903
Okay.
by a gentleman by the name of Mr. French as an activities building. In 1916, the Mimosa burned down. It was originally the McAvoy house, but when McAvoy died in 1885, and they decided to sell the property, it was under the condition that the name McAvoy came out of it. And I don't know why. So, Wilcox worked diligently surveying all this area, working with the railroad people. And on October 27th, 1875, Chief Engineer of the railroad, Thaddeus Coleman, presented to the Board of Directors of the railroad his new plan for shortening the previous route and going up the Saluda grade, shortening it by, quote unquote, some 7.5 miles, and thus save an immense sum of money. And the Board of Directors then determined, voted and determined that that would be the route up to up north. And the meeting was held at the McAvoy House. Exactly. Funny how all this worked. So with the final surveying and engineering completed, and I have to apologize for what I'm about to pass around now because it's very fuzzy, on March 28th of 1876, Wilcox granted the railroad the necessary right-of-way so that they could come through town and start going up the mountain. So, let's see, I was about to go into the map here, but since Julia already did that, this is the copy of the map, and I really had given up on it. I had asked everybody about this map that I kept hearing referred to in these deeds, and nobody knew anything about it. I had resigned myself that it had probably disappeared with the town hall fire, which was what, in the 50s, something like that. And I did a lot of back and forth with the state archives in Raleigh, and I was even up at the archives up in Washington. I could find nothing. So one day I'm in one of my countless times to the deeds office, and I had asked them about maps many a time, and they kept pointing me to a cabinet that had all modern maps, because that's really what they do, and they're focused on helping things going on today. Well, one day I went in the back room, and I see over in the corner on this table what looks to be an old book, and it was an old leather-bound book, about 2 feet by 3 feet, and there's all these frayed bits of maps hanging out. And I go over and I look at it, and I start flipping through it, and there's the original map about Shaw Hill, there's the original map of something out in White Oak. I mean, there are dozens of century-old maps in there, some of them linen and all wrinkled up, and they're just all kind of thrown in there. And I still wasn't expecting to see the map, and then all of a sudden, poof, there it was. Map of Tryon City, 1877. And on this map, and I'll pass around a small copy of it now, but please, I encourage you to come up afterwards and look at this. The blue is actually the railroad. I do not know where or who put, colored that in. But here's Trade Street, there's Pacolet, there's Melrose. It is so close to what we have now, it's really frightening. And what this told me was that the history that you hear, and I mentioned this earlier, I came to town and I didn't really understand the history, and I think to most people, history is kind of vague. It's kind of like, oh, the Indians met with Tryon, and then the railroad came, and then the toy makers, and Carter Brown, and the horses, and well, here we are. So, it was fascinating to find that what was designed before the railroad even was constructed was so similar to what we have now. You've got, there's glaring differences, like there's Tryon Street. That's where Palmer Street is now, and that's, Palmer, Dr. Palmer wasn't even a Clint in his grandparents' eyes when this map was made. Tryon Street didn't curve around. There was something called Water Street that went basically through what we know as Stotts Ford parking lot now. But all these other things are here. Oh, what we know is Maple right here. He originally had, we're sitting in lot number 6, but the street was designed to be another building, and it was Hickory Street, and it stopped back on this next street, which was at the time Trade Street. There are a few other differences, but it is remarkably similar. And obviously he had to go back and remember some things, because where we now know the cafe is was lot number 0, and where the olive oil store is was lot number 1/2. So I don't know, maybe he had a plaza plan out at first or something. So one of my favorite spots is the 4 single-acre properties that are bound by Chestnut, Melrose, Walnut, and Pacolet. And he sold those in 1881, although he had already marked them on this map, because I guess there was some sort of agreement, to a guy named Virgil Cornelius Dibble for $10 each. So that whole square, that includes where the Fine Arts Center is, the library, the Baptist Church, he sold for $40. I dubbed it Dibble Square, but that hasn't seemed to have caught on yet. So and then he originally had several lots where that Ballinger, T.T. Ballinger, and his father-in-law John Garrison bought, as well as he had planned Melrose Avenue to go straight. And I'm not quite sure, because the topology has changed, but he had Melrose Avenue going straight down to Depot Street, which is what we now know as South Trade Street. But I look at that hill and I'm like, how in the world was he planning that? But Ballinger and Garrison bought that land and those 4 lots and made the Tryon City Hotel, which of course became Oak Hall Hotel. Then they also, from Dibble, they purchased the lot number 31, which, and then they built the Baptist Church there.
So is that north-south, is that?
Yes, no it isn't. North would be more like this, because south would be down there. So it's not precise in that regards. Basically, all of what we now know as Tryon, downtown Tryon, was owned, subdivided, and sold by Wilcox. William Gillette bought all his land from Wilcox. In fact, if you look at the Tryon Historical Museum, at the original map of Gillette Woods, it's surrounded by lots that are still identified as Wilcox tract, including one which the restaurant next door was excited to find out about when I discovered it, was known as Huckleberry Swamp. He was also a very civic-minded man. He gave a lot to the town. This, for example, was from a deed in 1892, where he placed large stones at either end of Melrose Avenue. And he's very specific about how he did that. He says that he's donating Melrose Avenue to the town. He said all that portion of Melrose Avenue, 60 feet wide, and running from a stone placed by said Wilcox at the intersection of Melrose and Chestnut Streets, and the stone placed at or near Doubleday's line at the extreme west of said avenue. And so he sold that to the town for one. I guess everything had to at least have $1 associated with it. He donated an acre of land to Holy Cross Church, and the wording in there was, this is in 1882, quote, in consideration for the love and duty to Almighty God, he donated 1 acre of his remaining Melrose land to Episcopal Church. Another 2 acres, I think it was donated by a Sarah Jane Woods, at the same, like the day before. And after laying out the cemetery grounds, he deeded the cemetery to the town just in time for his own burial in 1900. And I'm guessing most of you know the story of the naming of the town. This was the railroad invited Mary Christie McAvoy, Dr. McAvoy's wife, and their host at the McAvoy House to name the new station. She chose Tryon City. She had once been the postmaster of Tryon, which wasn't here. There was actually a post office up Howard Gap Road on the slopes of Tryon Mountain, which was called Tryon. And the incorporation of the town of Tryon City in 1885 is a completely different story altogether, which I haven't figured out. And Wilcox didn't seem to take too much of a role from what I can tell. He let his friend T.T. Ballinger pretty much deal with all the municipal things, and he kind of stepped out of the picture. Like I say, he was very quiet. He appeared to be a very quiet and modest man, based on all I read about him from the Wilcox diaries. But I'll get to that in a minute. But there was one more wrinkle before the town of Tryon really took off. It seems that some of Columbus's Mills' family didn't think that the property transfer in the early 1870s was proper. So, and that they didn't believe Wilcox had clear title, and the Mills family should still have it. So in May of 1894, Mary Curtin, and Mike, do you know exactly the connection between Mary and Mills? Was it the...
She was his sister.
She was his sister, okay. So she sued Wilcox for basically where we are now. And it's really interesting in the diaries, Annie Wilcox talks about when they're preparing for trial. Lem is running around, Lem is what she called him, running around the house looking for all the documents that had to do with the sale. And then he goes into Columbus, and they had to go up to Hendersonville for the actual trial. And this is another area which I want to research more. And fortunately, Wilcox prevailed, and the judge dismissed the case, and Tryon went on being what it is. So were it not for Lima Wilcox and the Pittsburgh oil and whiskey money, which he brought with him, the town, which eventually sprung up at the bottom of the Saluda grade, may have ended up in any number of locations and had a completely different name. What began as a minister's search for a healthier environment for his family resulted in several generations of immeasurable contributions to Tryon. And as I mentioned, the only ones that are still here are Keith Grady and his daughter. And they still have a home that's been in the family since the 1920s. And they have been a great source of information, family stories, and inspiration in me and researching all that. It's been a really great pleasure working with them. But let me kind of give you a quick overview of some of the characters that were in this family. First, Leland McAvoy. Got a picture somewhere. He was born in 1816 to a Baptist quote-unquote celebrated revivalist minister. And he followed both his father and his brother into the ministry. He graduated from Western Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh in 1834. Then he led the Crossroads Presbyterian Church from 1838 until 1872 when he moved here. As well as being a minister, he invested heavily in real estate related to the oil industry. And then his passion became the climate of the area. And he unquestionably established the Tryon area as a resort destination. That's why his name is probably known more than Wilcox's is around here. They named the crossroads there Lynn, which is often said to be named after his son, but his son was named after McAvoy's mother, whose name was Jane Lynn, so whoever. It was one of the two. So it was, it was a lot, largely due to this evangelizing that Tryon became a magnet for well-educated and open-minded people. And that, I think, has shaped the character of the town today. Reverend McAvoy met the train daily. A couple things here first. This is the McAvoy house way back then. I do not know for a fact, but this is one of the theories I have, is this family around it is actually McAvoy and Wilcox and all the family, based on the ages and the number of people in the family and everything else. It would have made sense for them to have a family portrait there as well. So at any rate, so he met the train daily. His appearance described in one paper of the day as his face wreathed in smiles as he talked and assisted ladies and children to get out of the cars. And there are numerous newspaper accounts of the day of talking about traveling through Tryon up the mountains that extol his hospitality. And it was at the train depot that he passed away, probably where he wanted to, in March of 1885, after, as one paper described, quote, he had walked hurriedly from his house to the station, and upon his arrival he sat down and in a short time expired, without a struggle or word. Now this would have been the original depot over where the Nina Simone statue is now.
How old was he? What was his age when he died? You know?
Yeah, 69 years old?
Okay.
March of what year did you say?
1885, March 14th. Okay, on to Lem, as his wife called him, unquestionably the most important figure in the history of Tryon. At some point, a nondescript quarter-mile street over off of 176, just over by the school, was named after him. But other than that, there really, and one other thing which I'll mention in a moment, there's really been no recognition of him. Hardly anybody knows who he is. And the street sign there is all crumbly and really needs some brushing up. Even his home, where probably more decisions about land and the shape of Tryon were made than anywhere else, is not really known as his home. It's known where a poet died, with all due respect to Sidney Lanier. It aggravates me to no end every time I hear that referred to as the Lanier house.
But Sidney Lanier died in Lily's arms.
Yes. His wife and his mother, and I guess his daughter, took care of Sidney Lanier his final days. And Lily would be Keith's grandmother. Excuse me?
I have a question.
Yes.
Is this house coming around, is that where the third story was added on?
Yes, there was a third story added on, and that gave the 30 rooms.
What's the source of this picture?
That is, Mike, isn't that from the University of Pittsburgh site? Somewhere up in Pennsylvania.
It's not in Library Company of Philadelphia.
No,
This
it's
is
not.
a different.
That's a different
I
one.
don't remember the source.
That may be from the Polk County Historical Association. They've got, they've provided a number, and I need to make sure I give them credit where credit's due.
They do, they have it now, I don't know, but I don't know where they obtained it.
Okay. So, Lemel's wife, Annie, kept a diary from at least from 1893 until her death in 1908. This diary, of which we have several volumes, Keith has, which I'm currently watching over for him right now, provided a remarkable glimpse into the daily life. There's one of the volumes is right here. I'll explain that in a moment. We see how hardworking and modest her husband was. He worked tirelessly for the community right up to his death in 1900. In the later years of his life, founding the Tryon Hosiery Mill, surveying and selling land such as Hogback Mountain in the final years of his life. The hosiery mill that he built was responsible for about 300 jobs and 800 residents
Wow.
in Lynn. The hill there, in fact, I think Ray McLeish, you live on that hill? I think it was known, who was telling me that? Was it you? Yes.
Flat Rock Hill?
Ambrose, Flat Rock Hill, because all the workers had moved down here from Flat Rock.
I don't live on that hill.
You do?
I do not.
You do not. You live next to that hill, right?
I get their mail all the time.
Okay, so Annie noted in her diary Lem's feeling about the people who populated the village he founded, which I wish I could say was true now, but I think it kind of is. It's the intent. She's noted in one of her diary entries, quote, "Their working days are over and they come here to rest." And I would like to know where you rest around this town, because there's always going on. So this last year, the Tryon Town Commissioners passed a resolution proclaiming August 31st as Lemel and Wilcox Day to commemorate his importance for the establishment of the town. We're just now beginning to scheme how we're going to celebrate this 150th year of that, and we're putting Marty in charge. For those of you who don't know, what's that?
What was the date again?
August 31st. Chris Armbrust is already planning to close down Melrose Avenue. Fortunately, the Fine Arts Center is closed.
Of course he has.
I will just be happy that we won't have people going 40 miles an hour down there. So, at any rate, I have not, stay tuned for what that will entail. Now, his daughter married a young doctor straight out of University of Maryland Medical School from Greenville. His name was Earl Grady. And in her diary accounts, she notes that they're dating, his courting her, coming over for dinner, them going out for day trips, and finally their marriage in 1898. Lily continued the diary for a couple of years. In fact, the volume we have here is from 1910. But she noted several diary entries. She noted that she was only doing it because of a promise to her mother. And then she'd note about how much trouble Elizabeth and Keith, their daughter, were getting into, and then she'd be off for a day or two. So Dr. Grady, because as you probably all know, became one of the area's most prominent doctors, founding both the first, this is Dr. Grady in his elder years. And it is a darn good thing that Keith Grady had this picture in his home, because this very picture was also hanging on the wall of the Polk County Historical Museum, labeled as Dr. Palmer. So I said, Keith, is that Dr. Grady? He said, yeah, that's my grandpa. And I was like, okay, we got to fix it now. I'll pass that. So most people think, when they think of the first pharmacy in town, they think of who? Missildine. And they would be right, partially. Dr. Grady took Ernst Missildine under his wing and taught him the basics of pharmaceutical arts. And they opened the first pharmacy, which, as you can see from this picture, is called Missildine and Grady. And Missildine then went off to Raleigh to formalize his education, came back. Grady sold him his share of the pharmacy. Grady moved to the upstairs of that building, and Missildine had the pharmacy below. So between the two of them, they took care of the health needs of Tryon for several decades. And in 1911, Dr. Grady became the first owner of an automobile in town. The Asheville paper in 1911 noted that he had taken possession of one to see if he liked it or not, and if he decided he was going to have it, it would become the first vehicle in Tryon. That vehicle was a 1911 red Maxwell. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but it is a very classy, it's the classic, open roof with the brass headlights on either side, just gorgeous. Now I happened, in looking through the pictures at the Historical Museum in Polk County, I happened upon this postcard, which, of the day. And in the background up here, you will see the Mimosa Inn. So this was done before 1916. This car, now I can't tell you that it was his car, but it is a Maxwell of the era. And this, when I pass around, you'll see it's basically like two farmers, a farmer and his wife and a cow in the middle of the road, and somebody standing up on the seat yelling at him, get out of the way. Now, this gentleman in the farmer's outfit looks suspiciously like a picture I found the negative of in one of the diaries, which we all kind of concluded, probably given the context, was Dr. Grady. So my guess is this is Dr. and Mrs. Grady, Keith's grandparents, pretending to be farmers in the middle of the road, while Frank Wilcox is in Dr. Grady's car yelling at him. Frank Wilcox was Lemuel's son. So that's just a theory on my part. I have no proof of it, but the ponderance of the evidence is there. And that's my story. So Mrs. Grady, Keith's grandmother, was very active in the leadership of several of the civic organizations, including Lanier Library, until her death in 1930. They had two children, Keith and Elizabeth. Keith's father was one of the original toy makers, and in fact his picture is right up here on the wall. He's the one standing there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's the middle of the pictures. That's Keith's father back in the toy maker days. And their daughter Elizabeth, well, let me tell you about Elizabeth. She married a gentleman by the name of Harold Crandall, who had moved to Tryon with his parents in the early 1920s. And they purchased many of the lots along Melrose Avenue and built several buildings, including Spanish Court, the restaurant Auberge, which is now La Berge, and small condos, and Hidden House and other things. And Hidden House was built it complete with, I presume when they built it, there are two large ceramic cats right on the roof line that showed the whimsical nature of the Crandalls. And even prior to their marriage, both Elizabeth and Harold were very active in the theater scene. Harold did a lot of, they both did a lot of acting. Harold did a lot of directing and producing of the plays for Drama Fortnightly and later the Tryon Little Theater.
And costumes.
Well, I'm getting to that. Julia, you just got to stop. It's like, you're going to keep giving my stuff away.
She gets so excited, she just.
She does. So Harold made the sets for many of the plays, and many of the pictures that you have of the old drama fortnightly things were sets made by Harold Crandall.
I have pieces of them in one of the bedrooms.
Do you really? Oh, that ought to be interesting. Do you have them,
They're in.
the ones that are in the pictures? No.
They're the actual pieces.
Oh, okay. So Keith once described to me about how when he was a boy going up into the attic of Hidden House and finding Uncle Harold, which I gather he was a good-sized guy, a tall guy, of him sitting on a little stool in the attic with sweat beading off his back while he's at the sewing machine making all these elaborate costumes for the place. This is our Harold and Elizabeth in their younger days. It's okay if I show this picture up. I have to say, I don't think anybody that knew Elizabeth, well, I don't know, I guess they wouldn't be surprised to see her. This for the about 1930 or so. And they were pretty flashy pictures for those days. And he was a handsome young man.
So it was during the Roaring 20s.
Yeah, I like to say that the Crandalls put the Roaring and Roaring 20s around here. And their home and the Hidden House and Auberge were the epicenter of Roaring 20s life here in Tryon, from everything I can tell. I mean, it is not hard to search on Hidden House and find stories of parties. And I'm speaking for Keith here. He explained to me once that they would move all the big furniture out of the great room there, roll up the carpet. They'd bring in bands from Asheville. The grounds in the back were reviewed. Back then, it was vineyards. So all that area that you know of, Byray, behind Melrose, were vineyards by the Whitney and Lindsay vineyards. So you had a clear view out to Hogback Mountain. It was like sitting out at Overbrook now. And so they had different levels with all these statuary and fountains and everything else. So it was you can almost be back there, imagine, Scott Fitzgerald standing there with a martini. Okay, so one other person, let me finish this. After Harold died, that was in the early 60s?
Yes.
They were in Hong Kong.
They were in Hong Kong, and Harold passed away. Elizabeth came back, and she later married Arthur Falwell, who was from another Chicago family. And they had been known for, they donated the garden behind the Art Center. And they're in the Lanier Library now, in the nonfiction room, the fiction room, which they, I gather, donated. There is a large portrait of Elizabeth and her second husband, Arthur Falwell. So they gave a lot to the community. I mean, the generations of that family that made this community what it is, it's just astounding. And then there's one other Wilcox I want to mention. Was Lemuel's niece, Lois Wilcox. She moved here in 1908 with her parents. Lemuel's brother had been a successful coal industry executive who had fallen into very ill health. And they moved here, and Lois by the time they moved here, Lois was in her teens. She had already been nationally published in magazines for her artwork when she was a young girl. And she continued. She became a rather well-known Impressionist painter, studying every summer up at the Old Lyme Art Colony, and her artwork of her Impressionist paintings of the Tryon area were shown around galleries and museums around the country. So, I'm going to close now, and I'm going to close with two quotes that I discovered in my research that I think are just amazing how they describe Tryon. One is from Helen Ashley Carver, who wrote those articles. And if you have not seen it, I've scanned it in, but there's a book that they compiled all of her columns, and it's fascinating. Her writing is it's just amazing. If you can get a hold of a copy of this, and I should probably have one here in the museum that everybody can come and look. It's just astounding. But at any rate, so in one of her columns that she wrote, she describes what it was like to walk down Melrose Avenue in the 1890s. She says, quote, "Hidden away beneath Tryon's red clay must have been always some form of lodestone which drew hither people with marked characteristics, not cranks, except to the young and indiscriminating, but people with personalities raised to the nth degree. To do justice to them would require a more expert pen than mine and a more voluminous publication than the world's smallest." And then something Lemuel's granddaughter, Elizabeth Grady Crandall Falwell, Keith's aunt, noted later in life, still rings true today. She said, "Change is inevitable. What draws people to Tryon is the direction of change. There were three things that distinguished Tryon from the beginning. People had a happy dependency on their friends for entertainment. They had a willingness to do it yourself, and they had a basic love for the outdoors. With the world getting more complicated, people here more than most still consider these things important."
Wow,
Actually, if you have any questions, Julia's here.
I'm really sorry for stepping on your story.
Julia, you know about that.
Yes, I know. I just want to point out that we have, Robert has had reproductions of this original map done, and they are available for sale. If you want to get one today, that'd be great. If you want to do it at another time, I happen to have them at my store, the Tryon Joy Makers, and the Chocolate Shop, and the Rug Shop. And
Any proceeds go to fund things like
Yes.
this exhibit.
Yes, they're going, that is very, very true.
They're not buying Julia's chocolates.
Well, you can bring your lunch money for that. But anyway, this is absolutely amazing because I think that, I know, having grown up here, and I think that Buddy and Shields will agree with me, that a lot of this story was not really widely known when we were growing up. And it has been a joy to see all of this history uncovered. And I knew Harold and Liv Crandall, and they were the most amazing people ever.
She was like
And I was
Annie
just
Bates.
privileged. Oh, she was everybody's Annie Mae. I got invited to my first cocktail party there. It was so exciting.
I was given a bourbon and water at 15.
Yeah, that's,
Yeah, and you drink, you have a little bit of that left by the end of the night.
yes.
So, a slow drinker.
It was, yeah, baby, I had my parents as chaperones, and I had one sip of my bourbon and water before it sort of disappeared.
Robert Lange, thank you. You are
Yes.
a treasure to our community.
Yes.
And for all that you've done and for the wonderful exhibit that you have
Yes.
given.
Our association, it really, it is with our docents and our volunteers, and we are survived with our membership, and please sign our register, which is on the desk, and if anybody's not a member, we'd love for you to join, and if you'd like to come and join us as a docent, we'd love for you to do that also.